I would love to have probiotic bacteria that clean my teeth. So I don't need to floss, don't need to brush my teeth. I don't need to go to the dentist. And even better, from a business point of view, you probably want a subscription product with subscription revenue. But from a engineering biology point of view, you should be able to engineer the mouth microbiome so that these things just hang out there all the time.
Hey, Carl, what's up?
Hey, everything's good. How are you doing this week, Erum?
I'm doing great. It's been a bit weird. Did you hear about that Chinese spy balloon? Or
How
I
could
don't know if
you?
it's a spy balloon. I don't know.
Yeah, how could you avoid it? It was in news of the day for several days. Who knows? We don't know whether it's spying or not.
China's saying it was civilian, which is fine. I haven't dug deep. There might be more truth uncovered by the time you're listening to this. If it's spying, I wonder what it's looking for. It looked like it had some type of sensors. Did it have some type of technology where it could determine the type of air composition is, or I don't know, could it be biospying on us?
Bottom line is United States and China spy on each other all the time. It's just two superpowers. They have an industry of spying on each other. We know that's happening. Biospying is an interesting idea. I think at some point we should get Miriam El-Gabi on here to talk about biosecurity. I think Megan Palmer talked a little bit about it, but I don't know if Miriam or Megan would be able to talk about what does biospying look like.
Yeah, that's true. It's gathering some type of intelligence and what is going on in the American population in terms of like human bodies, and then what's going on in the environment. There's a lot. And I'm sure there's a lot of sinister things. You can generally talk about DNA and creating some type of like super virus if they had certain DNA information. And I'm digressing here, but it's a brand new world as we see when we look at what's going on in the biotech industry.
And it's interesting that you say that about tracking people. We know that we are all tracked digitally. I just started reading Annalee Newitt's newest book, and one of the things that she talks about is the use of spores to track people. And we know that idea very well because our friends at Annika, who are here in Brooklyn, are using spores to track produce through the supply chain. So I think it's interesting that you bring up the spore thing, and I can't really comment on the terraformers yet because I just started reading it. But the other thing that was really in the news, which I think was a big deal, was last week, Colossal Biosciences announced that they were going to de-extinct, is the word. You've corrected me on this, the dodo bird.
Interesting, but did they de-extinct the woolly mammoth yet?
That's their big project. So they have not de-extincted that yet. They're working on it. I don't think the company is very old. I think it might be 2, maybe 3 years old. But what's interesting is that the dodo news made it to Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update. And I think that there is no bigger way for anything to be announced than on a Weekend Update.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. Yes. Being on Saturday Night Live is definitely like you're up there. Have you talked to any of the Colossal people? I wonder if they saw it.
I'm sure that if we tap into our network, someone will tell us what they thought about it. It was a very funny little mention, probably less than 30 seconds. So we should put it out there and see who saw it. And then what did the Colossal people think? So I'm excited about today's interview because we're talking to John Cumbers. And John is a co-author with me on What's Your Bio Strategy. We've known each other for many years. And one of the things that I think John has done very well is create this community for synthetic biology that is separate from the biopharmaceutical community.
When you told me about John and SynBioBeta, I thought it was very smart because there are a lot of biotech conferences, and that's predominantly biopharma. So you have all the Pfizers, AstraZenecas of the world talking about developing therapeutics. However, the subset of what we talk about here at Grow Everything oftentimes, and we will get to biopharma in future episodes, synthetic biology, and John Cumbers has curated that beautifully, all the different companies that are there. You've been going since the beginning, right?
I started going year 2. I don't think I was at the first one. And I think that initially what became the conference was a series of meetings that happened at VC law firm conference rooms. So that grew into a conference that took place in the mission-based area of San Francisco, then outgrew that space. And now it's being held in Oakland at the Oakland Marriott, which is where it'll be this May.
And so how many years has it been around?
It celebrated 10 years last year in 2022. So it was started in 2012. And I think the first time I went was 2014.
Oh, wow. So it's like the same amount of time. What's Your Bio Strategy was 5 years. So you met John at SynBioBeta, developed a relationship with him, wrote the book. If you guys haven't read it, go get it. It's great. Talking to all the leaders at the time. And you've been going to it. So what goes on at SynBioBeta?
All sorts of great stuff. You get presentations on the main stage from companies and investors, and there's panels with thought leaders, and you're starting to get more people who are outside of synthetic biology. So for example, Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple, was there a few years ago. Vinod Khosla, who's one of Silicon Valley's premier investors, and then Eric Schmidt, ex-Google CEO, now leading Schmidt Futures, big interest in biotech. He's there. And then you get a lot of breakout sessions, smaller panels with companies that are very topical. And then you have an exhibit space where companies are showing off their products and their tools. And then the networking. The network is top notch.
You mentioned that you spoke at SynBioBeta, and like during that time, Joe Zahner was also there. Do you want to share a little bit about what you were talking about and what Josiah was doing?
Joe Zahner is a biohacker who is a big part of this series on Netflix called Unnatural Selection that we've talked about a couple times. And Joe at the conference injected himself with a myostatin protein that supposedly would make his muscles grow bigger. I don't know what the effect of that was. That particular incident has gotten a lot of notoriety. I was across the hall giving a lecture to a full room of people about how to grow dragons, which is something that I've talked about a fair amount. We've never talked about it here on the podcast, but I have talked about it at the SynBioBeta conference. And that was a time where I was really focused on that a lot. So it's an exciting place to be. We'll be there in May this year. If any of you listeners are going to be there and don't know us, you should meet up with us.
Of course, John is a delight to speak with. So I'm very excited for our audience to listen to what John has to say. And let's get this party started.
Let's go. So, John, we're thrilled to have you on this podcast. We are the fastest growing podcast in biotech.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
So we know that your appearance will help us grow even faster. There's a lot for us to talk about. We want you to be a friend of the pod, and we hope that this is the first of many appearances.
Me too. Love it. Love what you guys are doing.
You guys don't know each other. John and I are partners in crime and have known each other for a long time. And Erum and I have known each other for a really long time, but you guys have never met. And Erum and I worked together like 6-7 years ago. And then Erum went and did a startup. So you guys have that in common. And then Erum rejoined the messaging lab almost a year ago. And it's been an incredible ride. And we just got started.
That's awesome. Yeah, I remember we were writing our book 5 years ago, and Erum had a big part to play in helping us keep things in order and make sure that it got published in time. So thank you, Erum. Good to meet you virtually in person.
I hear so much about you, not only through Messaging Lab, but through other companies that we work with. Of course, I'm a big fan of SynBioBeta. I subscribe to the newsletter. I listen to your podcast. So you are a podcast pro. So it is going to be a treat to hear your podcasting skills. But I would like to know, like, why did you start SynBioBeta? What powered you to start the organization and continue to grow it?
I didn't know anything about biotechnology when I arrived at Edinburgh University in 2004. I just completed my undergrad in computer science and information engineering. And I didn't know what a gene was. I didn't know what a protein was. That was 19 years ago. And I opened this Pandora's box of this code of A, C, T, and G, and this other code of 20 different amino acids. And this beautiful thing that unfolds in front of you called evolution when you start sequencing DNA and comparing sequences together. And so this beautiful Pandora's box opened up in front of me. And what was interesting is that I got into biology for two reasons. One, I wanted to live forever. And two, I wanted to settle the solar system. And these two things are absolutely going to happen. I don't know on what time frame they're going to happen, but they're absolutely going to happen. So I knew I needed to learn about biology, but little did I know then that this field that I would stumble across called synthetic biology was actually going to provide the toolkit that enables both of those two things to happen. And so I combined that deep tech knowledge that I learned through my master's program in bioinformatics and then went on to do a PhD in cell molecular biology. And I combined that deep tech skill with this other skill that I have, which is for connecting people together. And I've always loved connecting people together. You can put me in a room of strangers and within 30 minutes, I will have whipped up a community in that room and be introducing the strangers that I've just met to each other and telling them why they should be talking to each other. And I've got no idea why my brain loves to do that. Actually, I do know why it loves to do that, because I have dyslexia. And so I don't learn from reading. I learn from speaking to really smart people. And so in order to learn a lot, when you have dyslexia, you've got to meet and connect with a lot of people so that you can learn from them. So that's why I love doing events and connecting interesting people together. And the topic that I found just fits with my life goals of living forever and going into space. So that's what I'm doing.
Awesome. You mentioned that you love putting people together, and we love putting people together as well. I think that's part of the reason why you and I get along so well. But when you talk about synthetic biology or biotech to non-biotech people, how do you talk about it? What do you say? How do they react?
I often start with a cell and a question, which is, do you know how genes relate to proteins? And most of the time, the answer comes back no. And that's a great answer to have, because that's probably the same as 99% of the people in the world who don't understand how a gene relates to a protein. But when people are honest that they don't know how a gene relates to a protein, that provides a wonderful baseline of knowledge for you then to build on top of in terms of what people are interested in and what they know already.
John talks about the way that genes relate to proteins. And in the past, we've talked about the central dogma of molecular biology, which is this idea that you have a DNA sequence that is transcribed into an RNA sequence, which is then translated into a protein. That DNA sequence that codes for that protein is the gene. So the relationship between a gene, which is code, to protein is what John is mentioning. And I'm sure we're going to get into that more in future episodes.
And then I start asking, where did you come from? How do you exist? And what are you made of? And then we get down into cells, and then we get down into how does a cell grow and replicate, and how many cells is your body made of? And it's somewhere between 40 and 100 trillion. And then we talk about what happened at the beginning of your life when there was only one cell with 2 copies of your genome in it that turned into 100 trillion cells. So I just take them on this wild journey of biology. And along the way, we open up all sorts of cans of worms and talk about proteins and DNA and transcription and translation and the central dogma and cellular differentiation and gradients of chemicals and all the wonders of biology.
And what kind of reaction do you get from people when you take them down that path?
It's a reaction of amazement and wonder. I used to do this on plane rides all the time, just sit next to people. And when they ask me what I do, I had converts enthusiasm. I don't have it any longer. Maybe I do. I get an amazed reaction from people because people don't know this, and there's nobody talking to them and explaining it to them in a passionate way.
That's really deep to think about that, just from 1 cell to a trillion. It definitely gets the gears turning. And it's a big part of speaking to the mainstream. I do know that you write for Forbes, and you have been for many years, and to write, I'm sure, about topics that relate to business. I'm curious which stories have gotten the most traction. What are you really interested in? What has been something that you're working on? How are you talking to the Forbes community about synthetic biology and what's going on in the industry?
The big picture always through the Forbes column is to reach out to the Fortune 1000 companies who aren't using biology, who don't know what a gene is, how it relates to a protein, and to talk to them about how the disruption of biological technologies is coming, just like the disruption of internet technologies, just like the disruption of electronics, just like the disruption of the cell phone. These things are coming in biology, and if your company is not prepared for it, then you are going to be disrupted. And the most beautiful example of that is in the manufacturing of things and consumer goods and materials and chemicals. So my favorite topics are where we take a application like biomining and say, who knew that more than 20% of the world's copper is extracted using microorganisms? Or we take bio-based leather and said, who knew that you could make mushroom-based leather that has the performance properties of a cowhide? Or who knew that you could take a probiotic hangover cure and you can drink it when you drink your first drink and wake up without a hangover? So all of these different products are out there, and they're just a glimpse of what the next 100 years of biology, which I like to call the century of biology, is going to offer us.
Have you gotten any pushback on any of the columns, or people just being negative?
I got some pushback about vegan leather from the European cowhides industry, which is fair enough. They're an industry that's scared about the future of what's going to happen. And there were some things in there that weren't right in the article. There was some opinion in there, so that they had every right, I think, to push back. Occasionally I get some critical feedback on whether things are accurate or not, and we go in and we'll try to put in clarifications or corrections if we've made mistakes. But in general, no, people are quite excited about it.
You started a tech company. I had in my past. I think in the future, I will start a biotech company. Karl and I always talk about potential companies that we would start, but you've been seeing so much going on in the space. You see the gaps, you see the opportunities. Is there a company that you would start, or do you have any ideas that you want to throw out there?
I would love to start a oral probiotics company. And I put this in our book, Karl and I's book, What's Your Biostrategy? But I would love to have probiotic bacteria that clean my teeth. So I don't need to floss, don't need to brush my teeth. I don't need to go to the dentist. And even better, from a business point of view, you probably want a subscription product with subscription revenue. But from a engineering biology point of view, you should be able to engineer the mouth microbiome so that these things just hang out there all the time. So you actually just need to take a pill, they're in your mouth, they're incentivized to stay in your mouth, and they're incentivized and engineered to clean your teeth. No more dentists, no more fillings, no more cleaning, no more flossing.
So we're going to have like big dentists come after us and be like, don't share that podcast. That's really exciting. I really like that idea.
I wonder what the turnover is for the flora in your mouth, or just in general, what's the turnover for the flora that live on your skin, but in your mouth in particular?
Yeah, I don't know. Interesting question.
It depends on what you eat, I'm sure.
Yeah.
If it's really crunchy, maybe scraping them off. I think we could go down a rabbit hole, so maybe we can save that for another conversation.
We started asking this question if you had a certain amount of funding, and we've upped the number to 250 million. Is that the company that you would start, or what would you do with the 250 million to make an impact?
One of the biggest things that will have an impact on our whole industry is not necessarily a company, but it's a policy. And that policy is the carbon tax and dividend, because right now we're going through this process of sucking up all this oil from the ground and burning it, mining all this coal and burning it, putting all this CO2 into the atmosphere. And we're seeing all of the issues that increased CO2 is having on our water level and our global temperature and our extreme weather patterns. So if we had a carbon tax and dividend, which would tax at the point of use the CO2 at the point of production, and then divide up that tax between everybody on the planet or everybody in the country, that would disincentivize people to put out CO2. And that in itself will put a price on the CO2, and that would encourage anybody who's building with biology, sucking in CO2 or consuming glucose and fixing it into a product, that would incentivize them. So I think there's one big thing I might do with that 250 million, which is to start a lobbying organization that can effectively push on the carbon tax and dividend. Now, let me think again. If I had $250 million and I wanted to start a company, would I do the tooth microbiome? I hate to say it, but could it be done with 250 million? Although we're all believers in synthetic biology and making biology easier to engineer, it's still really difficult to engineer biology. Although I dream of that product, can it be built? We don't know yet.
If you have to take it through any kind of clinical trials process, which you might have to, 250 million isn't going to get you there, but it could get you beyond proof of concept and set yourself up in a really nice way for partnership.
It's a big industry, the dental cleaning. I did look it up. I think it's 20 billion annually in the US just for dental cleanings, if I remember
amazing.
Correctly. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that about lobbying for carbon credits, because just recently the United Nations Secretary General, who is Antonio Guterres, who used to be Prime Minister of Portugal, he's been very strongly advocating against the fossil fuel industry and really taking them to task. He's one of the few people who have a role as big as he does that are very critical of the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah. And we all want to consume less energy, yet we all continue to consume lots of energy. So I would like us to be able to tax it, and that by the economics of increased costs would decrease the use of it. It's such an elegant solution. And I am very frustrated with all of this patchwork of different policies and different solutions. And, we're subsidizing companies to take CO2 out of the air, particularly under the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of CO2 capture technologies. That's what we're down to right now. But at the same time, we're still paying for oil and coal that we're sucking up and burning. So it's really crazy.
Yeah, we're still subsidizing the fossil fuels industry while at the same time doing this patchwork of subsidizing carbon or decarbonization industries. John, you and I have worked on a number of things together, most notably, what's your biostrategy? And I'm curious, what do you think needs to be written? What do we need to do to get more SynBio, more biotech into the mass media? And do we need to do that?
I think we do need to do it. I think that we need to change people's behavior, people's understanding, people's acceptance of engineering biology. And I think that comes from cultural change. Now, I've heard that cultural change comes from religious change. So I think it's probably time for a new religion as well. I think we should have a new religion, very similar to Buddhism, digital Buddhism, something like that. From that would come cultural change, and from that would come behavioral change.
That's interesting because at the start of the episode, you mentioned like your driving force for SynBioBeta is living longer and establishing civilizations in different planets, and it reminded me of like the singularity a little bit. So if you read Ray Kurzweil's Singularity is Near, it is that transcending biology. And I know this is getting very deep, but that could be in a religion in and of itself. But have you given that a lot of thought?
I have. I think it would just be called You. The letter would be You. We'd pray 6 times a day by meditating. That's one better than the Muslims because you've always got to up the latest religion. We'd probably pick Thursdays as our day of rest because Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays are taken. And we would worship the prophet Satoshi Nakamoto, the founder of Bitcoin. When we pray, we would face Boca Chica until Starship is launched. And at that point, you would turn to face Mars. We need a new story, a new narrative, new rituals. And that should see us 100 years into the future. And then we'll be all set. And there should be something in there about having children, but having children with purpose. Because, I mean, that's what the Catholics do. They say no contraception because you've got to go out there and have as many children as possible. That was a religious strategy to grow the population. I think we need to do something similar about having children, encouraging people to have children, but having a reason for having children. Right now, a lot of people have children and they have children just because it's the thing to do. Now, I have a couple of kids and I love children. They're amazing. And I don't necessarily want to be a tiger dad where I'm like, you must be this, you must be that, you must do this. I think that would be horrible to have children have those expectations. But I do think that there's a big opportunity here to rethink what children mean and the role of children in society and the reason for having children.
How does this fit in? I've heard you in the past say that you want to start a city. And I know other people are building cities. In Saudi Arabia, they're building the line. But how does this idea of this new religion fit into your concept of building a new city?
I saw a tweet recently. It said, I don't know a single entrepreneur who doesn't dream of starting their own city. And I think that's true. Everybody dreams of it. Why do I want to start a new city? I want to start a new city because I don't think the cities that we've got are very good. I don't think they're very functional. I don't think they're very nice places to live. Some of them are. And I've never lived actually really downtown in a city. I've always lived in the suburbs or outside. But yeah, I think there's something innate about humans that we want to go settle new places and we want to go build. And I want to make things better. I want to innovate as well. So innovating around the core of what it means to be alive, I think is a pretty interesting place to innovate.
Will the city be in the United States? Or what part of the world would the city be?
It could be anywhere. So I'm a big believer in the network state, which is a book by Balaji Srinivasan. And the idea is that we could start a network state. SynBioBeta could become a network state. And we gather together people in a digital way. We then group together collectively, own land collectively, share currency, and agree to certain principles of living. And then eventually we can become a sovereign state and get political recognition from other countries. So I think there's a wonderful playbook that Balaji has to do that.
It's a fun read, his book. I like the way he lays it out too. If you can only read a sentence, if you can only read a paragraph, you can only read a page. So it gets as deep as you want it to. But I'm in favor of a city that is built around biology and leverages all the tools that we're creating to create a biological state. And maybe the digital network state is the transition or is the catalyst for that.
I think so.
I think probably NASA, they're going into the Arizona desert and trying to like terraform or go underground and make these test grounds.
Yeah, you might be thinking of the biosphere too.
I've heard,
Yeah. And then there's a number of Mars simulations out there. But I think what's interesting is that you don't need a particularly glamorous place. You need enough people, a critical mass of people, because there are plenty of places in the world that are really miserable places to live, but they've got a density of the population there, and you've got an economy and you've got culture and it works. London is a really good example of that. The weather is really terrible. It rains a lot, it's cold, but yet London for a period of time was the center of the world. What made it that center of the world was the British Empire and the tentacles that it had out throughout the rest of the world that fed back into it. But London is not. There's plenty of much nicer. Now, London has built a beautiful city. Don't get me wrong. I love London. I think it's awesome. It's vibrant, full of culture. I'm just saying, like, weather-wise, there's plenty of other places that you could have chosen. So I don't think it's necessarily the geographic location or the climate. It just relies on having a certain critical mass of people to get something going.
Yeah, I agree. I love the idea of maybe visiting Mars or the moon, but I also worry that if these things are run by corporations, then it's going to be like Aliens, where the corporations are just, they're in charge of terraforming and it all becomes about the shareholders and things could get ugly.
Do you want to get me started on something?
I don't know. Do I?
So Esther Dyson told me about this guy called Matt Stoller.
Oh yeah, I know Matt.
So he has a Substack called Big, and it's all about
Yep.
monopoly power. You got to subscribe to this, because if we think Comcast is bad, it's the whole US economy. It's all of these giant corporations that are jostling for dominant monopoly power, doing regulatory capture, capturing the politicians with campaign contributions to keep the laws in favor, and then starving the Federal Trade Commission so that it can't break up these monopolies that have been formed. And so we're seeing that now with big tech. We're seeing it with Ticketmaster. We're seeing the new head of the FTC, Lena Khan, is really coming down on some of these monopolies and has resources to take them on. I'm pretty positive about the future of distributed things. And I think these network states and distributed economies, combined with the power of the FTC to break up these horrible monopolies, which create baby formula shortages and egg shortages and things like that. Real free markets would solve those problems instantly, but these ossified monopolies can't compete. There's no competition, therefore there's no incentive for them to do anything about it apart from just increase pricing. In fact, I just heard that I think 70% of the inflation is caused by monopolists just increasing pricing because they can do.
I think what people don't realize is, number one, as you say, inflation is being caused by the monopolists. People are taking advantage of, for example, the war in Ukraine. The Biden administration has come out against the fossil fuel industry for their record profits. But at the same time, I think what most people don't realize is that these big monopolies, they end up stifling innovation, which is what you were alluding to. And that innovation is really what America was built on. And we do have these phases where we have a lot of monopolies and then they get broken up. But I think now is a time where it makes a lot of sense, especially given the oversized power that big tech companies have had in general. I don't know that we've necessarily seen that in synthetic biology, but we've definitely seen it in the pharmaceutical industry and in healthcare.
What's taking so long too? I think the last monopoly breakup was in like 1984 and it was AT&T. That's a long amount of time. You think you'd learn and start seeing signs and prevent a monopoly from happening, but that's not the case.
Yeah, and the amount of innovation that came post AT&T's breakup has been tremendous. That's a case study in demonstrating what the benefits are of breaking up monopolies.
Agreed.
Since we're on the topic of dominance, a lot is happening in artificial intelligence. ChatGPT is taking all the headlines and it's in the mainstream. Everyone's talking about it, but no one's really talking about biotechnology. John, when are we going to get there where biotechnology is in the mainstream? And do you think we'll get as big as artificial intelligence?
It's a good question. I think we'll definitely get there. AI took 40 years, 60 years, and I think biology may take that long. I've been saying, when will biology have its chat GPT moment? We used to say, what are the killer apps for biology? That's not a good expression to talk about killer apps and biology. So I think chat GPT moment is the better way to think about it. Let's think of the areas that it could occur in. Certainly in healthcare. You can imagine getting your Grail blood test and it showing that you've got signs of early cancer, and then just going in and engineering your own immune system to go in and kill those cancer cells. Certainly, we're seeing an impact in food. And you could already argue with all of the GM soy and GM corn that biology has had its moment. Now, we know that's the most boring application that you could think of, is making crops pesticide free. And it goes with all the baggage of, again, monopolies and duopolies around food. I'm looking at my giant fig leaf tree here in my room and just thinking the potential to be able to engineer houseplants to look a certain way or do certain things. I think that's pretty exciting. I think those are three examples: consumer goods, food, and healthcare.
Yeah, I would agree. I think food, we know that it already touches pretty much everybody's life without them realizing it. Even I think that in personal care, it's a lot of ingredients are produced through fermentation, but most people don't realize how much biotech is in personal care products. And there's very few brands that put their biotech upfront, which is part of the problem. Switching the topic a little bit, John, you're from the UK. You run synthetic biology thought leadership programs all over the world. Last year you did it in London. I think this year you're going to do it in Venice. And I'm curious, what have you noticed is different in the EU versus the US when it comes to SynBio startups? And maybe even expand that to talk about other regions in the world.
There is no greater entrepreneurial ecosystem than in America.
USA, USA,
Yeah.
USA.
And I've been living in America since 2005. And I remember when I applied for grad school in America, and I think it was my sister who said, "Why do you want to go to America?" And I said, "I want to understand the mind of the superpower." And now I'm here. I've lived here for 17 years, and I well and truly understand the mind of the superpower, because the mind of the superpower has become part of me. I feel actually much more American culturally than I do British. Now, it's amusing because the British people think that America has no culture.
It's just a younger culture.
It's definitely a younger culture. It's more direct. It's more risk tolerant. It's more financially driven. It's more goal oriented. It's more visionary. Now, I haven't lived in New York before, but I did live in Providence, Rhode Island. And that's why I went to grad school. Without sounding too egotistical, there's something very special about California. And there's also something very special about the Bay Area, this innovation ecosystem. And I'm a world citizen. I'm from England. My wife is from Malaysia. We were in Borneo, where my wife is from, in Malaysia, over the summer. And my 11-year-old daughter turned to me and she said, "Dad, it's nuts. We're sitting in a cafe and the person we're chatting to is wearing a Golden State Warriors sweater. And he knows more about the California Bay Area basketball team than we do. And listen to the music, Dad. There's American pop music playing on the radio." And she said, "I did not know how influential American culture was until this trip." And I think she's got a great point. And then when I compare that to what's going on with Twitter or Tesla or OpenAI, I might have in the past said Google or Facebook, it's certainly Apple. It's really quite amazing, the center of power right now, the global center of power here, and the entrepreneurial spirit of capital, talent, and the pay it forward culture of done one startup, let's do another, and let's fund the next Steve Jobs who's going to do it. So the reason that you're not seeing so many synthetic biology startups in Europe or in China or in Singapore or India is because of the entrepreneurial culture, both of the US as a country and of Silicon Valley as a region. And you're going to find these startups that do succeed in other places, but there's so many tailwinds, at least for now, for this region and this country. That's why you see so many entrepreneurs that are starting companies here. It's so much more of an effort to rise above that entrepreneurial threshold where you've got enough free energy to actually start the company, dive off the cliff, dive into the abyss. So I think it's great. There's a lot of regional innovation. New York's becoming a biotech hub. A lot of companies there. We're going to come out there and do a mixer next month with you. And the UK has a lot of synthetic biology startups. India is starting to produce a lot of startups. China is doing amazing things. But there's something about the culture here that's very different from anywhere else I've been in the world.
I mean, we also have a lot of capital that first LPs and then investors are willing to deploy for synthetic biology. Yeah.
And people wanting to get rich. It's the American dream to get rich. Chinese want to be rich as well, but certainly most people in Europe, it's rude and ugly to be rich. It's crass. It's not appropriate to say that you want to be rich.
It is for sure our religion. It's interesting how your daughter honed in on our cultural imperialism, which a lot of people would argue against. But it's true. It is pervasive. You can't go anywhere in the world and not see the Golden State Warriors t-shirt and hear Beyonce on the radio or Rihanna or whoever.
Yeah. And entrepreneurship is becoming very mainstream. You have Shark Tank. That's very popular. People from all over the country are creating companies that are really smart or maybe not so interesting, but they're taking the risk. They're believing in themselves. And that's something that people are tuning into on a weekly basis, seeing Shark Tank. and then Silicon Valley on HBO and everything else. The stories from all the entrepreneurs are coming out of Silicon Valley, and just everything about the US is primed for creating entrepreneurs.
So speaking of Silicon Valley, John, you have one of the many special guests at this year's summit. Tell us about how the Silicon Valley thing came about.
So what Karl and Erum are referring to is Thomas Middleditch, who plays the CEO of Pied Piper in the HBO series Silicon Valley, is going to be coming to SynBioBeta in May. The dates are May 23rd to the 25th at the Oakland Marriott. And he is an LP, a limited partner in the venture fund 50 Years. And I met him at a party that Seth and Ella from 50 Years hosted in San Francisco last year. And so we approached him about doing a fireside chat on his passion for climate tech investing. And we put it on Twitter just last week, and a bunch of people are like, oh my God, this is amazing. He's my hero. One person was like, hey, isn't this like kind of exactly what's wrong with Silicon Valley? And isn't it a bit ironic that you're promoting this? And I think it's showing that we're not taking ourselves too seriously. It's really tongue in cheek, saying that we can take a joke. And I think it's quite wonderful, the culture that we have for startups and innovation and tech. But it's also, we can take a laugh at ourselves, at the funny things about it. So I couldn't be more thrilled to have him come join us.
It is a little meta, but I think it's pretty awesome.
So there was one thing that I wanted to mention that kind of ties a few threads together just now, because Erum, you were talking about global access to startup culture. I think that that's starting to appear, and it's starting to appear through a lot of these distributed companies, either the crypto companies or the DeSci companies in particular. A DeSci stands for Distributed Science, and it's a new track that we have at the conference. And we have about 20 speakers come in and speaking in the DeSci track. And I'm very excited about that. But recently I was speaking to the CEO of a company called LabDAO. And so DAOs are distributed autonomous organizations. And so a lot of these companies are springing up around distributed science, creating DAOs. Another one's called Valley DAO, which is a synthetic biology one. Another one called Athena DAO, which is women's health. Another one called Vita DAO. I think the first kind of big one was Vita DAO, which is doing longevity. And Pfizer just announced an investment in Vita DAO, which is phenomenal as well. The issue around access to startup culture really was highlighted by the CEO of LabDAO that I spoke to, Nicholas. I think it's Rengstorff is his last name. And I was chatting with Nicholas, and he lived in the US. I think his parents worked for IBM, but he's a German national. And when he finished high school, he had to go back to Germany. He had a California kind of upbringing and education, but he didn't have a green card. So he went back to Germany. And he said he wanted to do a startup. He had that culture of startup vibe, and he wanted to make an impact on the world. He said he didn't have access to the startup network. But what he said was that when the pandemic came and everything went online, particularly through Discord, he could now tap into this global startup culture. And he's got funding from folks in the US, I think, and folks in Europe. So he's kind of tapped into that whole startup network, even though he's not in Silicon Valley. And so he was talking about there is this global startup culture that we're all tapping into. And that's exactly what Balaji talks about in the network state, is this ability to tap into these network states and become part of a digital citizen. It's part of one of these networks, even though you're not necessarily in the geography. You can still agree with all these principles of this network state. You can still contribute to the economy of that network state. You can contribute to the civil society of it. So I think things are changing, and it's very exciting to see that.
Yeah, one of the things we've talked about, and I think is going to continue to be a theme of the podcast, is I talk about leapfrogging, what happens when developing economies have access to the tools of synthetic biology and are able to leapfrog technologically the way they did with cell phones, and what might be dual use applications of things that are developed in the developing world that we would have never thought of, because we live in the developed world and creativity is different everywhere. But we do always say, but biology is everywhere. And so I think that's an important point. So yeah, I think it's very exciting. We last week had lunch with two of the guys from the iGEM Design League. They cover all of Latin America. They're based in Mexico. They're out there teaching high school kids and college kids about SynBio and what's possible. I know you and I have both done classes with iGEMers around the world. And so it's very exciting to pay it forward to that next generation. We need a lot more of that. Just curious, we at Grow Everything in this podcast are trying to reach a broader audience, a more mainstream audience, or audience of people that don't necessarily know anything about biotech. What would you say to people about the progress and challenges of synthetic biology in general?
What would I say to people about the progress that we've made or
The progress that we're making. Yeah.
I think that it's dismal. It's really slow. It's difficult to look back and see how far we've come. Even though I think we've come a long way, I think we're still right at the beginning of this field, right at this beginning of this movement of making biology easier to engineer. We still don't know what thousands of genes in an E. coli cell do. We still can't model an E. coli cell. So I think there's a ton of stuff that we don't understand about how energy and how biology uses energy and how cells and proteins and enzymes are regulated. We're still at this very early stage of being able to truly engineer biology. But I'm very excited about some of these next generation DNA synthesis technologies that are going to make it faster, better, cheaper to synthesize, and then combining that with AI and looking at these large language models and generative models for the production of images and the production of text, and then thinking how we're going to use that for the production of DNA that's going to be able to write organisms. That's mind-blowing.
Have you seen any companies that are working in this space?
There are. So we wrote a Forbes piece about Absci recently. They're doing AI models for protein prediction. And then there's another one that was just published in Nature Biotechnology last week. I think it's called Profluent. And they're going to be speaking at SynBioBeta. Nabla, which is a spin out from George Church's lab by Bizwan. I'm blanking on Bizwan's full name. Big Hat is another one. There's a number of companies that are doing AI. Cradle Bio. All of these are looking at generative AI for the synthesis and design of proteins.
I was on TikTok a couple of weeks ago, and the entire feed was how to better use ChatGPT. But the one video that stood out was someone talking about the impact of AI on protein design. There's not a lot of sci talk or symbio talk out there, but it was the one that stood out for me. And I was like, oh, that's true. It's good to see this. We need more of these.
Yeah. TikTok, man, do we want that or do we not? That's the question. Can we afford to ignore it?
Yeah, I don't think we can. I think it's unignorable. It's a force.
It's so addictive, though.
It's that like form factor, like just being able to watch those videos, and like everyone's doing it now. YouTube's doing it with their shorts and obviously Reels with Instagram. So that form factor of watching videos very quickly in a feed is here to stay. But now what content's being delivered to you, all of that, it needs to be like sorted out. Hopefully it starts getting catered to what you're looking for.
I think we should bear all and say something that's on our TikTok feed that we're not happy that is on our TikTok feed. I've got one too.
I don't know. Like for me, I personally have trained the algorithm to feed up a lot of stuff in Spanish and French, and then actually more like how to speak Arabic, because I'm trying to learn how to speak Arabic. So those show up a lot. They don't dominate my feed. In terms of things that I'm ashamed that show up on my feed, I don't know. There's just so much stupid stuff.
Mine's like people showing off their travel. So it's, here's my view today. What's yours? And in like Switzerland and like somewhere beautiful. And I'm like, my view is just a building next door.
The streets of Brooklyn, they're beautiful.
The streets of Brooklyn, and they are. All right. Spill the beans, John.
So for me, it is disabled people who have some physical disability. And the only thing I can imagine is that, you know, when you're a kid and you see a disabled person, you stare and you pull on your mummy's or your daddy's sleeve and you say, and you point, you say, look at that person, and you point out whatever it is that they have a disability or so a disfigurement. And as you get older, you learn that's really not polite. That's very rude. And so now I have kids and you explain to them that's how this person is, basically train them to ignore it. But when you're on TikTok, you can stare and look because nobody's looking back at you. There's no stigma to doing it. So I guess it's this weird thing that's got into my feed. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder what search triggered that, or what you must have seen and watched all the way through.
It wasn't a search. Yeah. It was just like, whoa, what is going on here? And then, the algorithm knows.
I have differently abled people on my feed, but it's usually them accomplishing something that you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that person can do that considering their situation. So it's always a video of triumph. So I do like those.
Nice.
But speaking of mainstream, a question that we ask a lot of our guests is, what is a book or movie or something that you've seen or watched or read that is biotech or synbio related that you'd recommend for people to watch or read?
I think most of my friends and colleagues have seen this, but it's a 2-minute video by Vasil Natiuk, who is a friend of mine. And it is just called Synthetic Biology. If you go to Vimeo and you look at synthetic biology, you'll find this video. And it's just a beautiful vision of what the future could be if we could engineer biology. It involves giant bees that you can ride and architecture that's grown. And yeah, it's just a beautiful vision. And I watch it time and time again and show it in my presentations because it's just a lot of cool things that Vasil has looked at about things that could exist in the future.
Yeah, I've seen that. We'll definitely put a link to that in our show notes so people can see it. It is just very stunning and mesmerizing to see.
Very inspirational. Yeah, for sure. John, I think we've covered a bunch. Was there anything that we didn't cover that we should have?
We're hiring a head of content right now, and I'd love for you to send us awesome people who might want to reimagine what the future of biology looks like and join us at SynBioBeta to help us produce viral TikTok videos and awesome reports and wonderful newsletters.
That's something that we've been talking about throughout these episodes, is bringing people with different skill sets into biology. I'm sure someone in the audience would be just jumping up and down like, this is me, let me sign up. Where do they go? Just they go to synbiobeta.com. Is the job posted on your website?
It is, yeah.
Awesome. We'll put that in the show notes too.
Yeah.
Excellent.
All right. Well, this has been wonderful, John. Thank you so much for taking the time today. We really appreciate it. We know you're busy and we can't wait to have you back.
I can't wait to be back. And I look forward to seeing you in New York next month and at SynBioBeta in May.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having me.
Wow, that was a great interview.
John Cumbers is quite the thinker.
Yes,
he
he
definitely
is.
thinks very big. He has to. I'm sure he sees so many interesting startups out there that are doing incredibly ambitious things, as we heard in the podcast. You talk to him pretty regularly, right?
Yeah, no, John and I have become friends over the years, and I think of John as being the ultimate networker. He knows a lot of people. When I think of someone who knows everybody, he's one of the people that definitely comes to mind. He knows everybody in synthetic biology, and probably most people in synthetic biology know John.
Yeah, a lot of the concepts he shared, it's a way of rethinking the way things are done. Similar to like metascience, that's something we should talk about too in a future episode. When John is talking, he really talks from like bare bones, like he doesn't let current infrastructure cloud his thinking. He just thinks of what is possible. And I really admire that about him.
Yeah, same here. I think it's probably why he and I have become friends over the years. And I do very much appreciate him. I really enjoyed when he was talking about Chat GPT and all these new companies that are popping up around this kind of AI that seems like it's new, but it has been 40 years in the making. We do have a blog post on AI versus biotech on the Messaging Lab blog. And it's not really how does AI compete against biotech. It's more just like the interest that AI is getting so intense right now. And the question is really, why hasn't biotech gotten that kind of love?
John mentioned about DeSci and DAOs, and that was just very interesting to hear about the different companies that are being built. And on the Messaging Lab blog, we also interview Ari Lippman, who is he a partner at LabDAO or an investor? Or
he is one of the co-founders of LabDAO. And he is a partner at Mars Bio, which is a Los Angeles-based VC. So if you want to get up to date on what a DAO is and what LabDAO is, that's a great place to get started.
Cool.
Is there anything else? I thought it was a great episode. We've been getting a lot of great listens. We got a great comment, which I'll read next time we record. We've got some great episodes coming up. What are you excited about?
The next episode we'll have is Nicole from Alonia. So she's going to be talking about bioremediation, taking toxins out of the environment.
Yeah, very exciting. Yeah.
And a lot more. We have about 8 more interviews lined up with amazing industry players and people that are working in biotech. So very excited for you guys to hear that.
Yeah. So if you like the podcast, share it with your friends, give us a like, subscribe to us on Spotify or Google Play or Apple. And tell your friends. We are the fastest growing podcast in biotechnology, and we're excited to be able to grow more. And we can only do that with your help.
All right. Absolutely. Okay, guys. We'll talk to you later.